Thomas Miller hadn't expected company that night, much less the kind that would change the entire direction of his winter, and perhaps even his life. The quiet outskirts of Willow Creek had been his refuge for the past 2 months, ever since he and his husband, Michael, had separated. It wasn't a dramatic split. No fights, no shouting, no shattered glass or storming out. Instead, it had been a slow unraveling, a long, inevitable drifting apart until there was nothing left to hold on to. Thomas had moved to the small, aging cabin they once used as a vacation spot, convincing himself the silence would help him heal. But silence could be deceptive. Sometimes it felt peaceful. Other times it felt like it was swallowing him. Outside, the season's first snowstorm had rolled in much faster than the weather forecast predicted. By late evening, thick sheets of white buried the road and blanketed the forest. Thomas had settled into his usual routine. A cup of tea, a worn-out novel, and the fire he kept going mostly for the company of the crackling sound. He was halfway through a paragraph he'd read at least 5 times when a sudden, forceful knock rattled the front door. He froze. No one ever came this far out unless they meant to. The knock came again, firm, deliberate, urgent. Thomas set down his mug, took a breath, and opened the door. 2 soldiers stood on the porch, snow caught in their eyelashes, breath puffing into the cold night air. Their uniforms were damp, their cheeks flushed from exposure. The taller one stepped forward first, offering a polite nod despite the severe conditions. "Evening, sir. I'm Sergeant William Carter," he said, voice steady and controlled. He gestured to the younger soldier beside him. "This is Corporal Samuel Hayes. Our vehicle hit ice a mile back and slid into a ditch. Communication lines are down from the storm. We're hoping to take shelter until our unit can reach us." Thomas blinked, surprised but concerned. "You must be freezing. Come inside." William and Samuel stepped in, stomping off snow. The warmth hit them immediately, and Samuel let out a shaky exhale as Thomas closed the door behind them. "Thank you," Samuel said softly. His voice carried a gentleness Thomas didn't expect from someone in uniform. Thomas ushered them toward the fireplace. "Sit. I'll get towels and something warm to drink." When he returned with cocoa and blankets, the soldiers were standing near the mantel, examining the photos that still hung there, Thomas and Michael smiling on their wedding day. Pictures of their first home, memories that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "You have a beautiful family," Samuel said, handing back the framed photo he'd picked up. "Had," Thomas corrected with a faint smile. "We separated." William nodded in quiet understanding. "Happens to the best of us." Thomas wasn't sure what best meant anymore, but he appreciated the gentleness in William's tone. He motioned for them to sit. Once everyone settled, the room slowly filled with something it hadn't held in a long time. Voices, warmth, presence. "Were you 2 out on patrol?" Thomas asked. "Training, exercise," William answered. "Routine, until the storm became anything but." Samuel wrapped his hands around the mug Thomas had given him, savoring the heat. "I didn't think I'd ever be so happy to see a cabin in the woods." Thomas laughed softly. "You're lucky the storm knocked out the power at my place in town. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here either." The 3 of them exchanged a smile, the first shared moment of ease. As the storm howled outside, they talked, not about classified missions or dangerous operations, but about normal things. Favorite childhood memories, the foods they missed most while deployed, the towns they grew up in. Thomas found himself leaning into the conversation more than he expected. Both men carried a quiet weariness, the kind that mirrored his own loneliness. There was something familiar about their presence, something steady, grounding. At one point, Samuel reached for a log at the same moment Thomas did, and their hands brushed. It lasted only a second, but it sent a warm ripple through Thomas's chest. Samuel pulled back with an apologetic smile, but the softness in his eyes lingered. William noticed. Thomas could tell. But instead of judgment, there was something thoughtful in his expression. As the fire glowed and the night deepened, Thomas realized something unsettling and exhilarating. 2 strangers had entered his home because of a storm, but something else, something unspoken, was beginning to form in the spaces between them. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but couldn't deny he needed. The storm outside only worsened, hammering the cabin with sheets of snow that made it impossible to see past the porch. Thomas checked the windows a second time, more out of habit than necessity. And when he turned back, he found William and Samuel settled near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets and absorbing its warmth like men who desperately needed it. Thomas couldn't help studying them. William had the reserved calm of someone trained to hide every discomfort. Samuel, on the other hand, carried a quiet openness, a softness that fell out of place in military greens, yet somehow suited him perfectly. Thomas handed them both fresh mugs of cocoa, and Samuel's grateful smile lingered a moment too long. Thomas looked away quickly, pretending to straighten the edge of the blanket on the couch. "Storm like this isn't normal for November," William said, watching the fire. "Feels more like midwinter." Thomas sat across from them. "These storms come fast out here. Once the roads freeze, the mountains might as well seal themselves." Samuel blew into his mug, then looked up at Thomas. "Honestly, I'm glad you opened the door. We could have been stuck out there all night." "You have done the same for me," Thomas replied. Samuel smiled again, warmer this time. "Maybe, but still thank you." Something in the way he said it made Thomas's chest tighten. It had been so long since gratitude felt personal, not polite. William glanced toward the framed photos again. "You said earlier separated?" Thomas inhaled slowly, nodding. "Michael and I are still figuring out the legal part. The emotional part ended a while ago." Samuel looked down, thoughtful. "Breakups that fade instead of explode, sometimes those hurt more." Thomas bit the inside of his cheek. "Yeah, because you don't realize it's happening until it's already done." Silence wrapped around them, not uncomfortable but contemplative. The fire popped, sending tiny sparks upward. To shift the mood, Thomas asked, "And what about you two? Anyone waiting at home?" Samuel let out a breath that was almost a laugh but carried no humor. "No one waiting for me. Not really." William hesitated before answering. "There was someone, but military life doesn't exactly encourage stability." Thomas nodded knowingly. "Distance creates cracks, and neither person knows how to fill them." "That's exactly it," William said, his voice low but certain. "You look up one day and realize the person you love doesn't recognize your life anymore." Samuel studied William for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Thomas saw it. The shared history, the weight they both carried. It wasn't romantic, but it was deep, a bond built through long nights, dangerous missions, and trust that civilians rarely understood. Thomas suddenly felt like an outsider, and yet these two strangers also seemed drawn toward him in a way that confused him. The lights flickered once before going out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. Samuel made a small, startled sound, and Thomas instinctively reached for the flashlight on the side table. He clicked it on, casting a soft glow. "Power's out," he said unnecessarily. "Storm's probably knocking out lines across the ridge," William added. "Good thing the fireplace is old school," Samuel teased, nudging Thomas lightly with his shoulder as he sat beside him. The nudge wasn't meant to be anything. Probably, but Thomas felt it, and he didn't move away. William took a seat closer too, choosing a spot on Thomas's other side, as if instinctively creating a circle of warmth around the three of them. In the flashlight's glow, his usually stern features looked softer, more human. "You know," Samuel said gently, "tonight feels strange. Not bad strange. Just unexpected." Thomas swallowed. "Unexpected how?" Samuel looked at him, eyes reflecting the flickering glow. "I didn't think I'd feel comfortable tonight. Not after the Jeep, the storm, but somehow I do." William nodded. "It's rare, the way some people feel familiar even when they aren't." Thomas felt heat rise in his throat. Not the physical warmth of the fire, but something else. "You both feel familiar, too," he admitted quietly. None of them spoke for a moment. The wind howled. Snow piled against the walls. But inside, the cabin felt like a different world. One where time slowed down and uncertainty wrapped the air in a kind of charged stillness. Samuel rested his hand lightly near Thomas's on the couch. Not touching, just close enough to feel like an invitation that neither acknowledged out loud. William watched the gesture but didn't look away. Instead, he shifted closer, as if drawn in by the same quiet current. Thomas's heart thudded harder. What was happening wasn't physical, not yet and not inappropriate, but it was emotional, heavy, intimate. 3 men, each carrying loneliness of different shapes, suddenly found their pain weaving together in the dim glow of a powerless cabin. And Thomas realized something he wasn't ready to say aloud. The storm outside wasn't the only thing stirring. Something inside the house, between them, had begun to move too. The night had settled fully, the storm roaring like a distant ocean against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire cast a soft orange glow, the only steady light after the power outage. Thomas sat between William and Samuel, the 3 of them forming a quiet circle of warmth that felt strangely deliberate, as if none of them wanted to break whatever delicate thread had formed between them. Snow piled higher against the windows. Outside was chaos. Inside was stillness, except for the low crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing, close enough that it overlapped. When we were hiking last spring during training, Samuel said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "Our group got caught in a storm. I thought that was the worst night of my life." He glanced toward Thomas, a faint smile warming his face. "But this feels different. Calmer." Thomas returned the smile, softer. Storms feel different when you're not facing them alone. William leaned back slightly, his shoulders less stiff than earlier, as if the cabin's warmth had finally reached him. "Maybe that's a thing. Not the storm itself, but the company you keep during it." Thomas looked at the 2 men beside him. For months, since the separation with Michael, he had felt untethered, drifting. Tonight, for reasons he barely understood, he felt grounded for the first time. It wasn't just the presence of 2 strangers. It was the way they looked at him, not out of pity, but with a kind of recognition, as if each of them saw the bruises he carried inside, the invisible ones. Samuel tilted his head. "Thomas, can I ask something? You can tell me if it's too personal." Thomas nodded. "Go ahead." "When things ended with Michael," Samuel asked gently, "did you feel relieved or guilty?" Thomas's breath caught slightly. "Both," he admitted. "Relieved because I knew we were pretending. Guilty because I felt like I'd failed at something I promised to protect." William studied him with a steady, understanding gaze. Love changes with time. Sometimes it softens, sometimes it fades. But holding on to something empty, that's the real betrayal. Thomas met his eyes. "You sound like you've lived that." William didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to flames. "I had someone," he said eventually. "Someone patient. Someone good. But every time I deployed, I left a piece of myself out there, and eventually there wasn't enough left to give." Samuel looked at him gently. "You tried, Will." William gave a faint smile, one that carried both gratitude and defeat. Thomas felt the weight of their confessions wrapping around him. He wasn't the only one who'd been struggling. The loneliness he'd carried wasn't unique. It was mirrored in both men sitting beside him, reflected in their posture, their expressions, the quiet way they breathed. The fire shifted, sending shadows dancing across their faces. "Funny," Thomas murmured. 3 different lives, 3 different heartbreaks, and somehow we ended up in the same room tonight." Samuel's shoulder brushes again, not accidental this time. A saw connection, warm and subtle. Thomas didn't move away. William noticed. His gaze softened, not tense, not jealous, just open, thoughtful. "Maybe we needed this," William said, "a moment of clarity, or a moment of something else." Thomas swallowed. A moment of connection? Samuel looked at him with an expression that was almost painfully honest. "Yes, exactly that." The air shifted, heavier but gentler. Thomas hadn't felt connection in so long that the sensation itself felt fragile, like something he might break if he breathed too deeply. Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Thomas, tonight feels different. Like we're supposed to be here. With you." William nodded. "It's strange, but it feels true." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming wave of emotion he didn't know he'd been holding back. "I haven't felt chosen in a long time," he confessed. "You are," Samuel said quietly. The wind howled again, but inside, something steadier rose. Not passion, not desire. Something deeper. Something about being seen, understood, and not judged for the cracks in his heart. None of them moved closer, but none of them moved away. The space between them wasn't physical. It was emotional. A shared understanding that the night had changed them, even if tomorrow returned them to the world outside. Thomas stared into the fire, feeling both the weight and the lightness of the moment. When the storm ends, things will go back to normal. William shook his head. Back to routine, maybe, but not normal. Some nights stay with you. Tonight is one of those. Samuel leaned his head slightly toward Thomas's shoulder, resting just close enough to be felt. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad we ended up here. Thomas breathed out slowly, letting the warmth wash through him. The storm would pass. The soldiers would leave. Life would continue. But something had changed among the three of them. Something quiet, emotional, and unforgettable. And Thomas knew, with surprising certainty, that what happened that night would live in all three of their hearts long after the snow melted.